tonight, and thank you also to Mr Thistlethwaite, and of course thank you everybody for being here. I must congratulate you on that wonderful backdrop. It really is marvellous, and very appropriate of course for tonight. Look, the Palace letters, as you know, have just been absolutely phenomenal in terms of the public interest in them and in the court case over the last 4 years. And the first thing I want to do is acknowledge and thank the legal team who carried this case through from the very beginning 4 years ago. Anthony Whitlam QC, Tom Brennan, a Sydney barrister, and instructed by Cause Chambers Westgarth, and of course at the Federal Court Appeal, and then at the High Court we had Brett Walker SC. So a really stellar, committed and extraordinary team, all working on a pro bono basis, and this case could never have gone ahead, of course, without them, so I thank them all. And I also want to thank Grata Justice Fund that supported the case at the federal court level in an important way in assisting me with fundraising, and all of the chuffed supporters that made important donations, because it's been a team effort, a really major campaign that did involve crowdfunding, and you know, in many respects it's very unusual for a crowdfunded campaign with a pro bono legal team to get all the way to the High Court and succeed in a 6-1 decision. So it's been quite extraordinary, and that decision is a very, very important one that I'll come to shortly, not only because of the immediate impact, of course, on releasing these all-important letters. As Julian said, I wrote a 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam, the best part of a decade spent researching and writing that, and it was an extraordinary pleasure to do so, and a fascinating experience, and one that I was lucky enough to, of course, meet and speak to Gough Whitlam and interview him in the course of working on that biography. The other thing, of course, that I found in the course of that research was John Kerr's papers in the National Archives, and what an exceptional collection of papers they are. They'd only been opened really in the previous 2 or 3 years, and to my absolute astonishment, they just hadn't been examined, barely at all. And there were some really significant holdings that I think completely unravelled the story about the dismissal that we'd been told before. Many of you will remember the revelations about Sir Anthony Mason's role, kept secret from us for 37 years, until I found Kerr's absolutely extraordinary 12-page report on that very long involvement by Sir Anthony Mason, in secret, of course, from the government of the day while he was on the High Court bench, including drafting a letter of dismissal for Kerr. Just exceptional. It really, I think, completely obliterated the view that there was no collusion with others, that others didn't know, that Kerr acted alone, which was, of course, what I've called the dismissal narrative that was put out there so strongly from the beginning. So that's a background to the importance of these papers. And in those papers, there's a sealed, unattainable set of documents that had a very nondescript title, like A 1984-206 or something similar, which really gave no indication of what they were. But when I asked for them, I was told they're between the Governor-General and the Queen at the time, and they were deemed personal, and so I couldn't look at them. Well, of course, any documents between the Governor-General at the time that he is taking exceptional, unprecedented action as the Queen's representative using the reserved powers of the Crown, his discussions with the Queen were, of course, of vital significance to the history of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. And I was outraged, I must admit, by the fact that they were under the embargo of the Queen herself. So it's not just that for history, and this was really the dominating factor in taking this case forward, the history of the dismissal had already been so challenged by archival research. It was clearly very important to have access to these documents to clarify that history. But it was also, I think, an affront to all Australians that the Queen had embargoed such important historical records in our own national archives. The opportunity to do something about this and seek access to them through the courts came about only because of a meeting I had with Tom Brennan, the Sydney barrister. I'd read something Tom had written very strongly saying that we ought to be able to access these records, and I contacted him, and you know, many months later, almost a year later, we moved forward and I lodged a claim in the Federal Court of Australia. So the case began in the federal court. It moved through three areas of legal action, each of which we did not succeed at, being the federal court, an appeal at the federal court, before we finally came to special leave to appeal at the High Court. And we did succeed in gaining special leave to appeal. The case I found always absolutely fascinating in being a mix of history and, of course, law. And I felt that that was an extraordinary opportunity to see how years of archival research could feed into a case in this way. And the other thing it did that I think is really important was it got people thinking again about the dismissal and what we knew about the dismissal, and to some extent what we didn't know about the dismissal and why these letters mattered. And I think that really, as a big part of the last 4 years of seeking the letters, one of the things that's happened that I've found very pleasing as someone who's written about it for so long, is that many of the things that have been, I think, quite deliberately omitted from some of the histories or misunderstood in many of the histories or just forgotten over time have now become more apparent, and they've become a greater part of the received history of the dismissal. And I'm thinking in particular of the two things: the 1974 double dissolution election. One of the things Gough Whitlam always said, and that I certainly noticed when I first started working in this area, is how much that election, the 1974 election and the re-election of the Whitlam government, had got lost to history. Whitlam described it as in danger of becoming the election that never was, because so often the Whitlam government was described as a 3-year government that began in 72 and ended in 75, as if it was virtually just completing its normal term. And I could count so many times on which I'd had interviews with journalists and others who expressed astonishment that there was actually a 1974 election that brought the Whitlam government back into office. So that now, I think, is much more cemented in the popular memory and the popular history. But the second thing is, and I think this is still something that is less recognised, is that Whitlam was moving towards the half Senate election. And that was always his and the government's solution to the blocking of supply in 1975. Those two things were critical to look at together: the 1974 double dissolution and the half Senate election, which Whitlam was to call. And of course, Whitlam was at Yarralumla on the 11th of November 1975, precisely because over the previous 5 days, he and Kerr had finalised the paperwork for that election. And he'd arranged with Kerr just that morning the wording of the announcement of the half Senate election that he was to announce in the House of Representatives that afternoon. It was that motion and those documents that he was taking across to Yarralumla simply for the formality of Kerr's signature to then go out to the state governors to issue the writs. That's precisely why that date, the 13th of December for the election, could be called so quickly, because Whitlam had already set up all of the mechanisms to hold the election. It was to be a half Senate election on that date. And the reason the 1974 double dissolution is important is that Kerr's predecessor, Governor General, Sir Paul Hasluck, a man who held a very proper, very different from Kerr, held a very proper and appropriate institutional approach to that office, even though he had previously been, of course, a Liberal minister. Hasluck had worked with Whitlam in ensuring that supply, which again the opposition had threatened to block in 1974, but had not actually done so at that point, but were moving to do so. Hasluck ensured that the 1974 double dissolution was granted conditional on supply. And that was then put back to the Senate, which passed supply, knowing that in doing so it was ensuring an election. That's what Whitlam always believed would have happened in 1975 and should have happened, because Kerr should have granted the half Senate election. There was no reason not to. It was due. It's a Prime Minister's right to determine when they go to an election. And he should have made that conditional on supply being passed by the Senate, and to have put that issue back to the Senate to make a decision, either vote for supply or reject it. Because of course the Senate had never actually rejected supply. It had simply refused to vote on it and had sent it back to the House demanding that the government go to an election. They'd not actually specified what election, by the way, which I think is important. They'd simply said return and face the people, or some vague, it could have included the House Senate election. And in fact, some of the Liberal senators I interviewed, including Peter Baum, said to me without any doubt that had the House Senate election been held and had that been put to the Senate, they would have passed supply. They were looking for some movement from the government towards an election of any sort. So those two things are really important. And I bring that up now because I hope that the Palace Letters case has brought a lot of those, I think, more peripheral, but I see as very, very important aspects of the history of the day back into focus, and has helped us understand better, I think, some of the facts that have become distorted over the years. And it's certainly brought attention, I think, to the way in which so many secrets were kept from the Australian people after the dismissal, just as they were kept from the Prime Minister during the period leading up to the dismissal. So to fast forward to the High Court decision, one of the things, in fact, the key thing I think that the National Archives of Australia ran against my case in the Federal Court and subsequently the High Court was an argument effectively based on what's being called the Royal Convention of Royal Secrecy. And it was quite extraordinary to sit in the court and hear, in the years, 2018, 19 and 2020, arguments being put that there is a Convention of Royal Secrecy that we here in Australia ought to be upholding, maintaining and respecting, and therefore preventing us from looking at our records because the Queen says no, royal secrecy says we cannot look at them. And yet that was a very strong part of the legal action run, funnily enough, by the National Archives, which is a body, of course, tasked with releasing letters to the Australian public. And the second aspect of that argument was that our provisions in our National Archives ought to reflect the provisions in the British Archives. Now, it's very interesting, I think, to look at the British Archives as in itself, a reflection of a monarchical structure. In the UK, unlike here, they have a bifurcated, if you like, a divided system of archives, which really, to me, reflects the privileged position of monarchy overall. And that is that there's a special Royal Archives. The Royal Archives are in the Round Tower at Windsor, and into the Royal Archives go anything, and I mean this literally, anything that the royal family decree, even if it is existing within the public archives, the other part of the archives in the UK, and can simply place that into the Royal Archives. And your chances of getting anything out of the Royal Archives is pretty much at zero, even letters that are 100 years plus. Many of you may recall that Dr. Julia Baird, who presents The Drum, recently wrote a biography of Queen Victoria. And I've heard her speak about her difficulties in trying to get out of the Royal Archives letters, Queen Victoria's letters from well over a century ago. So, the difficulty here is that ordinarily royal correspondence and royal matters are simply closed to the public unless the Queen's private secretary says you may look at them. So we've achieved something through this extraordinary case that has simply not been achieved anywhere in the Commonwealth countries. It's been an exceptional High Court decision, a 6-1 decision earlier this year, in February in May this year, which found that the letters are in fact Commonwealth records. They're not personal records. They are no longer under the embargo of the Queen, and they have since been released by the National Archives of Australia after a great deal of toing and froing between our lawyers, I have to say, and some reluctance, to say the least, on the part of the archives to release them rapidly and in full. But nevertheless, I am extremely pleased, and I thank them for doing so. I think all Australians felt with the court decision that the ball was in the Archives Court to respect that decision and to release the letters in full. I'll just say a couple of words about the letters before we come to questions, and I'll be brief because I think this will be explored through the questions. So I'll just finish up with the court case by saying I think that because of the unprecedented nature of the case, the fact that it's very difficult to actually find a case in which you can challenge royal secrecy in this way, that this case will be used as a precedent in other jurisdictions in Australia, in our states, but also in potentially other jurisdictions across the Commonwealth where royal materials are held under this same embargo provision. And I think we might see, as you would expect in a modern democracy, a chipping away of these sort of what I see as incomplete post-colonial connections that prevent us from seeing our archives under the notion of royal secrecy. So that's the first point. The letters themselves, and as I said, let's have a lot of questions about them, but just as an overview, I have to say that I find the letters really disturbing. The more I look at them, the more disturbed I become, and I have spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 weeks unhappily immersed in the letters because I'm writing about them at the moment. But to say it's troubling is an understatement, to see the way in which the Queen's private secretary and our Governor-General are discussing matters that are of the greatest political significance, because of course some of these matters lead inevitably to the dismissal of the government. But more than this, they are doing so secret from the Prime Minister. One of the overwhelming elements in the Palace letters is the complete absence of the Prime Minister. And you find yourself asking, where is the Prime Minister? Why has nobody asked? What is the Prime Minister's advice on this? Kerr even, on several occasions and at critical points, indicates to Charterists that he is prepared to act against the advice of the Prime Minister, you know, the fundamental requirement of a constitutional monarch to act on the advice of elected government, elected ministers. I find this absolutely extraordinary. So as I said, as a sort of introduction to the letters, all of that I think is deeply disturbing. I think the role of the Palace is unassailable. It's a process of leading up to Kerr's decision to dismiss the government, and the way in which these letters inform and influence Kerr's eventual decision to dismiss the government. I find it untenable to suggest any longer that there was no role or no part of the Palace in that decision that Kerr made. You know, nobody has suggested seriously that it was the Queen's decision, that the Queen signed the letters, or that the Queen was behind the curtains in Yarralumla when Kerr dismissed the government. Of course, that's Kerr's decision. The critical question here in terms of the letters is, what role did the Queen, through these letters, have on Kerr's decision to do so? And that's where the letters, I find, are at their most disturbing. So it's been a fascinating few years. You know, I think back to when I completed the second volume of Gough Whitlam's biography, and I went to see Mr Whitlam with the second volume, and he was by that time not well. He hadn't seen the second volume, and looked at me as he looked at the cover and said, "Oh, is there only two, only 2 volumes?" I think he would have been delighted to see that the history has continued, and that in some ways that third volume that he laughingly suggested he might like to see has actually come about through the ongoing revelations of archival material, but in particular because of the Palace letters. So I'm happy to talk about that in any direction you want to take subsequently, but clearly one of the most important things we want to talk about tonight will be what is the impact of these letters on our discussions about a future democracy. Sorry, I should say a future republic, and how that relates to the workings of parliamentary democracy as we move towards that.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That's a wonderful overview and introduction, and a fascinating rollicking tale, the Convention of Royal Secrecy. Who knew? Let's hope it's not long for this world. Matt Thistlethwaite, my colleague, the Shadow Assistant Minister for the Australian Republic. Matt, do you want to unmute yourself and also make a few introductory remarks from the perspective of federal Labor?
Thanks, Julian, and thank you everyone for joining us. But firstly, can I, on behalf of the Labor Party, congratulate and thank Professor Jenny Hocking for your wonderful work and advocating really on behalf of the Australian people in the court that we all have the right to know our history and understand what exactly was in those very important letters that detail what exactly occurred in what was probably the most significant political upheaval in our nation's history. So congratulations and thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Julian, for bringing us all together. And Daniel White's on the call as well. Daniel is the convener of Labor for an Australian Republic and has been organising grassroots members of our party to ensure that we're keeping the message out there about the importance of having one of our own as our head of state. In reading the Palace letters, I just get this overwhelming sense of constitutional immaturity and a lack of confidence in the way we govern ourselves. And that's reflected in Sir John Kerr writing almost daily at that stage to the Palace, really seeking an assurance from the Palace that what he was about to do and what he had in his mind to do would be okay. And that assurance comes on the 4th of November in that letter from Martin Charteris, where he discusses in quite a bit of detail, too much detail in my view, the use of the reserve powers and the fact that they do exist. So that really reflects this lack of constitutional maturity that we have in Australia. The worrying thing about it is that it still exists to this day, that we haven't fixed that problem that occurred in 1975 by rectifying it in our constitutions and actually having a look at writing down what the powers of a head of state should be. It's also reflected in the fact that when our most recent Governor General was appointed, David Hurley, once again, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, had to get on the phone to Buckingham Palace again to seek the assurance that what he was about to do in terms of appointing the Queen's representative in Australia would be okay. Constitutional immaturity is still reflected in our founding document, and we haven't had the confidence to fix it. And that, I think, is a great shame. And it's reflected in the fact that some of the decisions that we've been unable to make as a nation and that affect the way Australians live their lives are still big problems for this country. And I point, of course, to the issue of the lack of recognition in our Constitution of the first Australians. When you pick up a copy of the Constitution, you'd believe that Australian history began in the 1770s. And now that's not the case. We all know that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been here for tens of thousands of years and have nurtured this great land and understand it better than all of us, yet they're not recognised in our Constitution. And again, that immaturity, that lack of confidence in dealing with this issue and the inability of government to work with the First Australians on an issue like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and finally have a voice to Parliament, deal with Makarrata and issues such as that, is again reflected in what Jenny uncovered in the Palace letters, that lack of maturity and assurance about ourselves. We have this tug of war with racism that goes on in Australia, reflected in the fact that one nation, they'll ebb and flow in terms of their political success, reflected in the fact that we still have the race power in our Constitution, something which doesn't reflect modern Australia and the way we all think we should be living our lives. And of course, there's the lack of confidence in appointing one of our own as our head of state. The first words in our Constitution, the very first paragraphs, talk about us federating under the crown of the United Kingdom and using their head of state as our own. And anyone that suggests that we stand on our own 2 feet and that we reflect this in our Constitution is told, oh, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. As if we're afraid to explore this notion that we are sensible enough, that we are responsible enough to develop our own system of government and have one of our own as our head of state. We all know that we're an independent nation. We govern ourselves, we make our own decisions. Yet we still have a foreigner as our head of state. It's unbelievable and it's outdated, and it's something that we think we have a responsibility to change. When Julie and I go into the Parliament, in the first session of every Parliament, believe it or not, we still swear allegiance to Queen Elizabeth II, her heirs and successors. No mention at all of the Australian people who just elected us to the positions, the wonderful positions and the great privilege that we have to represent them in the Commonwealth Parliament. Is it any wonder that there's a lack of trust and the standing of politicians within our community is some of the lowest that it's ever been? And if we are going to restore faith in the political process and in politicians, perhaps we could start by swearing allegiance to the people who elected us, not to a foreign monarch, and have this pervading antiquity in our constitution. So what Jenny's work has highlighted, I think, and rebooted in terms of a discussion in Australia is the importance of looking at how we're still seeking that assurance from Mother England, from Great Britain, through the monarch, about the way we conduct our affairs and govern ourselves. It doesn't represent modern Australia. It doesn't represent the role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have played in our important history. It doesn't represent our culture, our identity, and our position within the region. And it's about time we began a serious discussion once again about reforming our constitution to appoint one of our own as our head of state. Now, many of you would know at the last election, Labor took a policy of holding an indicative plebiscite if we were elected around the question of having one of our own as our head of state. Of course, in the wake of the election loss, we're reviewing all of our policies, but our commitment to an Australian Republic and asking the Australian people to reform our constitution to appoint an Australian as our head of state will remain. The Australian Republic movement at the moment are undertaking a 2-year consultation process, predominantly looking at what model Australians would like in terms of the appointment of an Australian head of state. We'll work closely with them on that, and we're eager to see the findings of their research. But at the end of the day, I think it's up to all of us, through organisations like Labor for an Australian Republic, to reboot this discussion about the importance of our constitutional arrangements moving forward for 2 reasons. Firstly, so we finally recognise our independence and reflect who we are as a people. But importantly, as Jenny has uncovered, so that these ridiculous situations of a Governor-General grovelling to Buckingham Palace about the actions that he or she should take in the future don't happen again. And we don't have to keep writing to Buckingham Palace about our future and the way we govern ourselves.
Thank you so much, Matt, for those introductory remarks. We'll get into the questions now, and we will go a few minutes over because we ended up starting 6 or 7 minutes late. Don't worry, I paid enough to Zoom for that to happen. It is ridiculous, isn't it? We have to swear allegiance when we enter the Parliament to the monarch. You heard it here first. I actually crossed my fingers and toes. There's a great photo of me crossing my fingers as I did the oath. It was the best I could do. Jenny, you said in your remarks that these letters bust the myth in some ways of Kerr acting alone, and that's been the great myth put out that Sir Anthony Mason's advice started to expose. The Queen prides herself, and as we're told, as a constitutional monarch. Did the Queen fail in her duties?
Look, I think that's the case. I think it's an unavoidable conclusion from looking at the letters and what we now know about the dismissal, because there's an appropriate way in which a Governor-General ought to be behaving, both towards, of course, his advisors in elected government, but also, of course, in relation to the Queen, the monarch, through her private secretary. And you can see from the very first letter that that is not the case. Kerr is writing about, in that very first letter, he is writing about the proclamation that he has to read for the 1974 joint sitting of Parliament, which of course was the historic only joint sitting of Parliament to follow a double dissolution in this country. So it was a very important occasion. The terms of that had effectively been set by his predecessor, Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, because there'd been 6 bills as trigger bills. they'd been put to the Parliament, they'd not been passed again, they all now had to be recited into the proclamation. It was really not something Kerr could question. He had the legal advisors' advice, that is the Solicitor General, the Attorney General, former Attorney General, and he disputed that. He wrote to Charterists and actually says that he believed the government's legal advice to him was not correct, that he disagreed with it, that he obviously felt constrained that he had to sign off and read a proclamation that he disagreed with, and that he went so far as to say was not correct. The High Court actually ruled on this because the opposition, of course, challenged almost everything about the government at that time, including the fact that 6 bills were going up to the joint sitting, and the government won. So Kerr was wrong, but that did not stop him undermining the government, including its formal advice to him at every point possible. And this happens again and again throughout the letters, and he is at no point, except in a very narrow point to do with the honours that the Royals were actually happy with and did not want him to continue undermining the change to the Australian honours system. But in these other critical matters, they let Kerr undermine the government in a most inappropriate way, and at times actively say he does not support the advices he has been given, and yet he has to formally send it. He is the conduit between the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister giving advice to the Palace on particular matters relating to royal matters like the royal title, the change to the Australian honours system, and of course Kerr's use of the reserve powers later. So I think where the Palace failed is in not making clear, simply by the nature of their response to Kerr, that these sorts of discussions were not appropriate. They were not the sorts of things that a monarch that is under a constitutional monarchy must remain politically neutral at all times. That is the key to this. And nevertheless, they let Kerr take his head on this. And I think that's really, that really sets the scene for what then unfolds a year later, is that Kerr is acting as though he has particular personal powers of discretion. He is acting as though he doesn't need to follow, and he actually says at one point, I do not believe that I need to follow the advice of the Crown Solicitor regarding the use of the reserve powers. I mean, you know, this is extraordinarily subversive of the nature of a relationship in a constitutional monarchy. And that's where I think the failing has been, the failure to alert Kerr to that. And he clearly knew that anyway. And that is why I think it's correct to say he read this as an encouragement from the Palace, as Matt said, for the action he was to take.
One of the astounding things on the day of the release of the letters, when the moment finally came, and some of us were anticipating it, 11 o'clock, was suddenly before the director of the archives got up, reports started appearing in News Limited papers, particularly the Australian, explaining that the Queen had nothing to do and that the letters exonerated her, referring to a particular letter. It's mysterious how they managed to get that ahead of time, isn't it? Nothing to see here. I'm curious, now that you've had a chance to look at the letters, what you make of this, what went on there, and how does the government spin, probably the Palace spin, the establishment spin, fit with the reality of what you found in the letters?
Yes, that very early call was interesting, wasn't it? It was one of the clearest attempts to set the agenda I think you could possibly imagine. It was choreographed beautifully, timed with the Director General of the Archives, who of course had lost the case, setting a scene with a whiteboard and with particular letters displayed on screen, and this was one of them, which is a letter interestingly written after the event. It's written by Kerr to the Palace after he has already dismissed the government. You know, and any historian, I think it was said by Nick Fagg in the Monthly the following week, that no decent historian, no respectable historian could read anything about the circumstances of the dismissal from a letter sent by the chief protagonist after it had occurred. But nevertheless, that's what was done. It's a letter from Kerr saying, I did what I did without first alerting the Queen to the decision I had made because I wanted to protect her and so on. Now, again, it's really a complete straw argument, a straw man argument, in which, as I said earlier, there has not been a dispute about the fact that the person who made the decision was Sir John Kerr. It's putting up a complete red herring. And to come to a letter after the event is not what we need to be looking for. It's an attempt to shift our focus to what happened, what was said afterwards, rather than the only place in which you could actually find evidence of the impact of these letters on Kerr's decision, and that was in the nature of the letters leading up to the decision. So that was very quickly put about. It went through the News Limited cycle in record time. It was reported in the British papers in the same vein, even with this extraordinary heading, the Queen has been cleared, you know, as though she'd been on trial. So a lot was read into a single letter written after the event that is simply unwarranted when you explore the letters from the beginning forward. And the other thing I'd like to say about that, Julian, is that almost later the same day, Buckingham Palace put out a statement, which is a very rare occurrence. They were driven to put out a statement about the release of the letters. And of course, surprise, surprise, they said the same thing, that the letters reveal that the Queen had no prior knowledge of the action that Kerr was to take. What surprised me, and I think again raises a concern in that statement from the Queen, from the Palace, Buckingham Palace, is that it does not mention our High Court decision. It restates again their belief in the Convention that correspondence between a monarch and a Prime Minister or a Governor-General or a Governor are private and personal. Now, put that together with the fact that we have just had an historic landmark decision from our High Court finding otherwise. And I think that is that's a grave disservice, to say the least, to our High Court, and the fact that we have exercised a degree of independence. It was described to me as a Republican decision of the High Court in asserting our own act. And it actually says this. There's a very strong statement from the plurality at paragraphs 122 and 123, which actually states that they are aware that this decision goes against the current wishes of the monarch, and goes against the current understanding of the private secretary, but that nevertheless the Australian statute through our Archives Act must prevail. And you might think how extraordinary that we need to actually make that comment in 2020, but we do, and we did, and our High Court did. So I find it quite disturbing that the statement from the Palace simply reiterated their belief in the Royal Convention of Secrecy effectively without mentioning our High Court decision.
You mentioned the private secretary there, and there have been a couple of questions received earlier. If you could just briefly clarify, what's the distinction between the Queen and the private secretary? Is anything to be made of this, or is it a fig leaf of convenience?
No, look, I've seen this mentioned many times, and there is no distinction. There can be no distinction. And the reason for that is that the sole nexus for communication between a Governor-General and the Queen is the private secretary. The private secretary speaks for and as the monarch, and Sir John Kerr, receiving those letters, receives them from the monarch. I have seen that distinction attempted by those who want to again say, look away, there's nothing to see here. After all, it's the Queen's private secretary. As if that should make it better, that really the monarchical guidance is actually coming from a bureaucrat in the Buckingham Palace and not even the monarch. So look, it's a preposterous fiction, really. And there are many, many times through the court case where, of course, the letters are referred to as the Queen's letters. Again and again, the archives description was of the letters to the Queen, and in fact, they were described in court as expressing the wishes and views of the Queen. So there's no question these are the Queen's letters. If there's an issue about whether Sir Martin Charteris actually told her about particular things, that's a different issue. That would reflect deception by Charteris of the Queen, and I don't imagine for a moment that that happened. Charteris also refers many, many times during the letters themselves to the number of times he has taken the letters to the Queen. She's read them with the greatest of interest. She's absorbed in her letters, he says at one occasion. And that is put back to Kerr on at several points. So make no mistake, the letters are the Queen's letters, and she can't hide behind her private secretary for the words that are her own.
I think it's fair to say, Jenny, that you'd know more about these events now than any living Australian, having immersed yourselves in this seminal event in Australian history for so long now. And I don't count the Queen in that as a living Australian, please note. Having finally been able to read these letters that you've been chasing now for some years, is there anything particular that surprises you having read them, and is there anything missing from them?
Yes, look, what surprised me, I think, is what I indicated before, that I have been surprised by the level of Kerr's disparagement of the government, which is continual. I don't think there's a single letter in which he treats the government as a respected, legitimate advisor to him. It is just extraordinary. And he has taken, by the middle of 1975, and he's quite upfront about this in his memoir and elsewhere, he's taken what he says a position of silence to the Prime Minister in relation to the looming constitutional issue in the Senate, the single most important, as you said, the most tumultuous period in our political history, and he has already decided to remain silent to the Prime Minister. All of these things have shocked me deeply, and as you said, I've spent such a long time in this, I pretty much thought there was nothing left to shock me. But I do think that, you know, I read some of these letters and thought he should not have been the Governor-General. And maybe this is another thing that Charters might have sort of quietly suggested. Why did he remain in office when he could no longer do the most basic thing that a Governor-General must do, and that is speak to his Prime Minister? It's simply extraordinary. So that has surprised me to see from the very first letter how Kerr has disparaged and at times undermined and even worked against the advice of the Prime Minister and of the government at different points. In terms of what's missing, we know now that there are actually some letters missing, and Karen Middleton wrote about this in the Saturday paper, and I've been keeping a list myself. You know, it's sort of peak nerd here about the events of 1975, but I think it is really important to recognise where there are gaps. And you know, you can tell this because one letter might refer to another, and when you go to look for that letter, it's not there. There's only a handful of occasions that that's occurred, but there's at least 5 or 6 letters that are referred to internally that aren't there. And there are some strange gaps in terms of what we know about Kerr that has perhaps only been revealed recently that also aren't there. For example, there's nothing from Kerr about his secret meetings with Sir Anthony Mason. Now, do we read from that the letters are missing? I don't think so. I think what that reflects is that Kerr is putting a very incomplete, is probably the politest way to say it, an incomplete version of the events that are happening in Australia to the palace. The other aspect of this is in the really extensive attachments. There are hundreds of pages of attachments in these letters, particularly around the months surrounding the dismissal. They are very, very selectively chosen. They're chosen as documents largely from the newspapers of the day, but not exclusively, which almost entirely have Kerr as the person front and centre, Kerr as the person who must make a decision. I'm looking at the moment in vain for a single article that he attaches saying this is the Prime Minister's decision on the 16th of October 1975, which is that he will hold the half-Senate election if supply continues to be blocked. There were good and interesting articles about that at the time. They're not the sorts of things Kerr is passing on. The half-Senate election is almost exclusively ignored by Kerr once it has been formally decided on that is the government's strategy. So yes, so there are some interesting gaps, some of them in extant letters that we know, others in areas that you might have expected Kerr to cover that he hasn't.
Thank you. A quick 30-second question before we then move on and to the so what phase of the discussion, I think, which is, well, what does it mean for the Republic and what do we learn from this? But just the personal question to you, I think you're a national living treasure for the work that you put into this and breathing life into this part of our history so we can look back on it. It's been an incredible journey, the refusals, the setbacks, the multiple court cases over many years. What drove you and how did you feel when you finally got to read these letters?
Oh, I'll try and be 30 seconds. Well, what drove me initially was history. You know, I knew from what I'd already found just how important archival documents were to the history, the real history of the Whitlam government and the dismissal of the Whitlam government. So I was absolutely determined. But the case was only possible because of the legal team. I can't stress that enough because it had to be a court action. It was not possible to go to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal for complicated reasons. But what did I feel? I felt absolutely elated. I felt elated for all of the people who'd supported this case, and there were so many of them. I felt elated for the fact that history could now at least incorporate these letters and what they mean into the rewriting of history, which it will undoubtedly come, and which I'm working on one myself, the book called The Palace Letters. But yes, so for all of those reasons, it's a really important decision, but also because the court decision, I think, is that rare example of overcoming royal secrecy and may well start to chip away at that in other nations, in other states, in other jurisdictions. And that will be a longer term impact of this decision. So pretty good all round, I think, is the 30-second answer.
Maintain the rage. So sort of opening it up to you and Matt, just thinking about the fallout. Do the letters, and you touched on the question, you know, was John Kerr fundamentally flawed for this role? Should he never have been appointed? Do the letters reveal a failure of personalities in the Queen, Gough's judgment in appointing and trusting John Kerr himself, or do they reveal a deeper failure and flaws in our system of government?
Look, I think it's, in some respects, I put it down to Kerr and to Malcolm Fraser. Let's not forget that we had a leader of the opposition prepared to do what he did in order to come to office. That's where the failings are. People often say, look, there were three big egos involved in this, and that's where the issue was. And if I could be frank, that's a nonsense. It's a nonsense because the Governor-General has no constitutional relationship whatsoever with the leader of the opposition. And yet by allowing Fraser to speak to him in the way that he did, and Fraser himself says he threatened Kerr that if he did not act against the government, he would expose him in the media as a Labor plant, etc., someone who was prepared to destroy the powers of the monarch afterwards. It was a staggering performance from Malcolm Fraser. He's the only so-called Prime Minister, he was appointed by Kerr, of course, but he's the only Prime Minister in our history to lose a motion of confidence on the floor of the House of Representatives, which happened on the afternoon of November the 11th, 1975, and refuse to resign. And this is just a part of the story that I think is often forgotten, but Fraser's role should not be forgotten. Kerr should have taken the government's advice. By failing to do that, he's allowed this myth, I think, of he was some sort of an umpire, as though there were two equal teams. There weren't two equal teams. There weren't two equal individuals. There was a Prime Minister and there was a leader of the opposition who should have had nothing to do with Kerr and with whom Kerr should have had nothing to do himself. So we come back to that central issue, which is that Kerr did not act on the advice of the Prime Minister or the government, and in my view, he did not respect the legitimacy of the Whitlam government.
And so I'll put now the next couple of questions to you and then to Matt. How do we stop this happening again, and what does it all mean for our quest to see an Australian as our head of state for the Republic? One of the most common refrains that I hear in the community when you raise this, and I'm sure we've all heard from our less engaged friends and family, is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That great Australian saying, you know, she'll be right, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Have the Palace letters strengthened the case for change in substance? Can they help us get more public attention? What's the way forward?
I think they have greatly strengthened the case for change, and from within ARM, the Australian Republic movement, we do know that the interest and the engagement with the sorts of things that are being put out and argued has increased really significantly. The membership has grown as well. I think there's 2 points to that. One is that what these letters tell us, and the entire process of having to access them in this way, what it tells us is in 2 sort of aspects. One is that, yes, in 1975, the contents of the letters show a really troubling relationship, secret relationship really, between the Queen through her private secretary and the Governor-General around matters that led to the dismissal of the government. But they also show that the impact of those connections, what Whitlam would have called the relics of colonialism, stretch today still into areas you would never have expected them to stretch. And in particular, of course, even into our own National Archives, where the Queen has been able to embargo letters, not only about our history, but a history that involved her. And she was able to place her own personal embargo over our access to that. So it is broken. That's the areas where it's broken. In terms of where we move towards a republic, I've long thought that it is not the way to go to codify the powers of a Governor-General. It may sound strange, but that's looking at this through the wrong lens. I think you have to ask, what is the key problem that is identified through looking at 1975? And it's 2 of the things that Kerr did, or should I say failed to do. The first is he failed to act on advice. And the second, if you look at the events of the afternoon of 1975, is that he did not respect a motion of the House of Representatives calling for the Governor-General to reinstate the member for Werra as the head of government. Whitlam won that vote by 10, that motion by 10 votes. And as you know, the Speaker was then sent to Yarralumla, and Kerr refused to see him. I think those are the 2 things we need to fix. And that's much more straightforward than codifying the powers of the Governor-General, which not only lead to an absolute hornet's nest in terms of moving towards a republic, but which then become justiciable. And you will have endless arguments at the High Court about what they mean in practice. So if you look at the British Fixed Term Parliaments Act, there's actually a very good way of clarifying that and cementing that. And that is something I've been suggesting at ARM, the Hocking model, to look at this through a means of actually ensuring that power lies in the Parliament where it should lie. And then a lot of those issues about what are the powers of the Governor-General become redundant, because the real powers are actually through the Parliament. And I think we have to find a clear and easy way to do that and bring those 2 different camps, if you like, of republicanism together in that form.
Thanks, Jenny. The Hocking model.
Yes.
We can develop it as we go. Matt Thistlethwaite, could you perhaps provide some comments and thoughts on the implications and the fallout of the Palace letters? As we've said, how do we combat the "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" refrain that we hear so often?
Well, I think Jenny's work highlights the fact that there is a problem in our Constitution, and that was reflected in 1975, where you had this tumultuous stalemate under our Constitution that basically shut down the Commonwealth government. The great failing is that we haven't fixed that it could happen again. We're just relying on the goodwill of an opposition leader not to do what Malcolm Fraser did once again. But that's one element of the Constitution, which I think needs to be fixed. There's other elements of the Constitution that, as I said earlier, don't reflect Australia. The fact that we haven't got recognition of the first Australians. If you read the race power to anyone, they'd be horrified that that's in our founding document. And there are so many other elements of the Constitution that are outdated. We know that it's very difficult to change the Constitution, but we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it and to try and explain to the Australian people the importance of having a document that reflects who we are. The fact that the drafters of the Constitution envisaged that we would continually update it. That's why they put the referendum power in it. And that we should, again, have a mature discussion about our constitutional arrangements moving into the future. Professor George Williams, written a very good book about a history of referenda in Australia. And the last chapter of his book points to what he calls the 5 ingredients for a successful referendum. And key in that is, of course, the support of the government of the day and the opposition. Unfortunately, I don't believe you're going to get a Morrison government putting the issue of, let alone constitutional recognition, but an Australian head of state on the agenda. That's why it's up to the Labor Party, to the RM, to take opportunities like the one that was presented by Jenny's work and the case to highlight the inadequacies in our constitution, some of the problems that we have with it, and try and just reboot a sensible, mature discussion with people who are willing to think about where our nation's headed and the future that we want as a nation.
Thanks, Matt. I've heard it described in colloquial terms that our constitution is, in global terms, constipated. We've now entered, it's one of the most difficult constitutions in the world to change, and we've now had the longest period since Federation where no government has even had the courage to put any changes forward before the people. What, 21 years now. Thinking about, there's a few questions came in, there's a couple popped up, but in advance, people with various suggestions. I'm curious, Jenny, then Matt, are there any steps that we could think about taking as a country via the Parliament ahead of constitutional changes being put forward? For example, reforms to allow the Parliament to appoint the Governor-General or recommend the appointment, to remove that prerogative solely from the Prime Minister. Are there constraints, as I think you touched on, Jenny? You said England has different requirements that may constrain or shape the Governor-General's exercise of power in some legislative way ahead of constitutional changes. Can we ban the Governor-General from writing to the Queen now? Can we shape the consultation or discussion that occurs with the Queen? Are there things that we could be thinking about putting on the agenda and doing in the next term of a Labor government while we prepare the ground for constitutional reforms?
Yeah, look, I think the trouble with looking in that direction is that anything really that touches on real powers in terms of the way the Constitution organises it, I think is going to require a constitutional change. And I mean, yes, we can do things around the edges, but it's going to be very difficult to move towards substantive change without actually doing so as a referendum. And as you and Matt have said, the difficulty here is that our capacity to pass referenda is just so difficult. I think it has been done without bipartisan support, but maybe only once but ordinarily it certainly requires that. But we have something unusual with the Republic where we do have across the major parties, and certainly with the Greens, a support in significant numbers now to move towards a Republic. So the other thing is, I think it is a moment that we can take as a great opportunity on a lot of levels. You know, we've talked briefly about the Uluru Statement from the heart, and I think that's a really, really important thing that part of a constitutional change, and I think these things are going to become inextricably linked. So there's many ways in which actually having a referendum that does that provides a break that becomes a meaningful break for us as a nation, and one that says we are moving in a new direction. We recognise the past, but we move into something that we contain around ourselves for the future. So in some sense, we're constrained around that. But I think what we can do before we get to that point is start these conversations. You know, those of you like me who were, you know, I was there at the big convention in Cora around the Republican convention last time, and you know, it's a huge moment. It's an enormous disappointment that did not succeed, but it's something that requires an enormous amount of discussion, an enormous amount of agreement, and we're going to have to be very careful about identifying exactly what the problems are, and looking, I think, for the easiest and cleanest way to deal with them that can bring people together. And I think it can be done. For the reasons you raise, it may not be possible to be done in the current term of Parliament, obviously. But in the next term of Parliament, I think we can come back to that. I thought that the two-stage process that the Labor Party had and went forward with at the last election is actually a really sensible one.
And thanks, Jenny. Matt, do you have any final comment on that?
Only just to add that I agree with Jenny. I think we need to start the conversation once again. And although Labor's in opposition, I think we should be pushing for reforms such as the establishment of a constitutional commission in Australia. Once again, we haven't had one of those since the Hawke government that was established when Lionel Bowen was the Attorney General, and appoint people like Jenny, non-politicians or past politicians, First Australians, representatives of community organisations, to have a good look at our constitution, to engage with the Australian public, to travel around the country and engage in rural and regional areas about the importance of our founding document, what it means for the lives of Australians, where there are deficiencies in it, and how we can all come together and work on doing that. The one thing that 99 teaches us, we all remember the Republicans that didn't like the model saying, don't worry, just vote no, we'll get another go at this in 2 years' time. We all know it's a once in a generation opportunity. And the next time we get that chance, we can't mess it up the way we did last time. It takes a lot of lead up work. And I think we need to begin that lead up work now through things like a constitutional commission.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Jenny's getting a few votes for president, I can see on the chat function there. If the ARM national convener role becomes available, a few of us might be knocking on your door, Jenny. I think in the interest of time, there's a bunch of other questions come in that are of huge interest, and we'll certainly forward you that chat function as well, because it'll give you a bit of a sense of other things that you might want to touch on in your book that you're writing at the moment. I'll give that a plug in a minute.
That would be great, actually. Thank you.
There's been a couple of questions about what does it reveal about Prince Charles, because of course, if we don't get our act together and get an Australian of head of state, we're going to be lumbered with the embarrassment of King Charles III in the not too distant future.
He does feature. He does feature in the letters.
He does feature in the letters.
Just a very important part of the letter. Actually, I was just writing about that today. But I'll reveal all that in my book.
Excellent, excellent. Hang on, I've just got to fix up a little mute problem here. Here we go. And sorry, just a little bit of muting going on. Great. And there's also, of course, interest that's come up in the letters. Are they all the letters that have been revealed? And what about all the other letters over the decades between the monarch and governors general, between state governors and the monarch? It's a fascinating question about how the Australian people can actually get their hands on them. And of course, the ongoing conspiracy about whether the CIA was involved. But I think we'll leave all of those questions for the book. I will just give the book a plug. Jenny's book, which she's been writing in isolation in Melbourne over the last few weeks, is due out in November with Scribe. Pre-orders are now available. So if you want to support Jenny in that way, you can jump online and order your advanced copy of the book. But of course, it's not the end of the conversation. The struggle goes on as we maintain the rage for what happened to Gough's government, the elected government of Australia, but continue our push for change and to see an Australian as head of state. So I'll now throw to Daniel White, who's the national grassroots convener of the activist group across the Labor Party, Labor for an Australian Republic, to thank our speakers and outline how you can get involved, and then that'll be the wrap up. Daniel.
Thanks, Julian. And on behalf of everyone here tonight and the Labor for an Australian Republic group, just like to thank our guest speaker, Professor Jenny Hocking, for a wonderful insight into the Palace Letters tonight, and also for her work on the National Committee of the Australian Republican Movement. So thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Julian Hill MP for all the great work in hosting tonight's event. It's been fantastic to see so many people involved, and being such a passionate Republican. So thank you so much, Julian. I'd like to thank Mr Thistlethwaite MP for all the great work he's been doing as Labor's Shadow Assistant Minister for the Australian Republic. Matt's been a great friend of our group when we formed back in 2012, and we've now got over 5,000 members, and our goal is to create an Australian Republic by 2030. So we've got an excellent executive team. We've got a few events coming up, which we'll let people know about. But if you want to get involved, probably the best ways, put some details up on the chat, but also if you, on our Facebook page, get involved. We'd love to have you on board, because we've got a really exciting next few years, and hopefully by 2030 we're all celebrating an Australian Republic.
Yeah.
Thanks
you.
very much, Daniel. And thanks to everyone. We've had people from every state and territory across the country register. As I said at the start, we've recorded Jenny's remarks in the discussion. So provided I manage to figure out now how to download that in the next few days, and one of my clever staff will turn it into a YouTube thing, we'll send the link around so people who weren't able to be here are still able to have another look at the talk. Thanks, everyone, and make sure you join Daniel's group, Labour for an Australian Republic. Have a great night.
Julian. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, everyone.